Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you here joining us this afternoon in the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us remotely by YouTube. Today we look forward to hearing Talmage Boston tell us about what he's learned about the U.S. presidents in the course of writing his new book, Cross-Examining History. A Lawyer Gets Answers from the Experts About Our Presidents. Talmage will be upstairs after the lecture to sign copies of the book. Before we hear from him, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the next couple of weeks. On Wednesday, November 30th at noon, we'll present the first of three programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor in the U.S. entry into World War II. Author Steve Toomey will be here to discuss and sign his recent book, Countdown to Pearl Harbor, 12 Days to the Attack, which unravels the crucial characters and moments of this critical event of American history. And then the next day, on Thursday, December 1st at 7, we'll join the National Constitution Center and the Constitution Accountability Center to present a panel discussion called The 14th Amendment's Shield of National Protection, a Constitutional Guarantee of Liberty and Equality. The panel will discuss how the 14th Amendment enshrined the promise of liberty and equality in our Constitution and its implications for today's most important issues. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online or in print. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it physically or virtually. Relatively few people become close to U.S. presidents. We may see their images on screens giving speeches or toasting foreign heads of state, or perhaps be surprised by a motorcade. The best chance to get to know a president is probably after his term, when his papers become available to researchers at a presidential library. And the National Archives is in the process of helping set up a new one for Barack Obama. 3 truckloads of material have already made their way towards Chicago. Today's speaker, Talmage Boston, took a more personal route in preparing his book, Cross-Examining History. Some of the experts he interviewed have their own close ties to the National Archives. David McCullough, Ken Burns, H.W. Branch, Taylor Branch, Mark Updegrove, Linda Johnson-Robb, and Douglas Brinkley have all appeared on this stage. Historians, filmmakers, and White House insiders such as these have strong bonds with this agency and our mission, whether it's through researching in our records or sharing their knowledge with the public programs we sponsor. I invite you to come back again and again to take advantage of the variety of talks, films, and other programs based on topics represented in our records. With holdings of records measuring in the billions of pages, our scope is wide and varied. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Talmage Boston. He has practiced law as a commercial trial and appellate litigator in Dallas, Texas since 1978. In addition to maintaining his full-time law practice, Talmage has written Raising the Bar, the Crucial Role of the Lawyer in Society, which includes a foreword by Dick Thornburgh, former Attorney General of the United States under Presidents Reagan and Bush. He's also written 2 critically acclaimed baseball history books, 1939, Baseball's Tipping Point, and Baseball and the Baby Boomer, and has been inducted into the Texas Baseball Hall of Fame as a media member. And in recent years, he's become one of the best-known onstage public interviewers in Dallas. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Talmage Boston.
Thank you, David. What a great honor it is to be here at the National Archives. This is truly a dream come true. Somebody from Dallas, Texas, speaking at such an important place in American history and for the preservation of American history. Well, it's now been 10 days since Election Day, and I suspect many here are still processing the outcome. Some of you are probably pleased with the result. Some of you are probably disappointed with the result. And the question is, I'm just out of curiosity, is anybody ever going to trust the polls again? Is anybody ever going to trust the experts, the New York Times, Washington Post, or the major television networks again? Somebody will? Okay, I'm glad somebody will. Well, the choice this year obviously was, shall we say, complicated. And as we begin looking to the future, the good news is, for many of you, is I'm not going to say anything good or bad about President-elect Trump. That would be very foolish. If I did, I would lose half of my book-buying audience. But what I am going to do in the next few minutes is give you some food for thought from the pages of presidential history, give you something new and different to chew on the subjects of the key traits of presidential leadership. And then I'm going to close with some thoughts on public expectations for a new presidency based upon our past. First, I'm going to talk about presidential leadership. I suspect many of you have heard the adage that most people love history for two reasons. Number one, it shows us how much things change. And number two, it shows us how much things stay the same. One of the main ways that history shows us how much things stay the same is that the traits that make for a great presidential leader are the same in 2016 as they were in 1789 when George Washington was sworn in. Now, for my new book, Cross-Examining History, after completing my 31 onstage interviews with top presidential experts, I synthesized some of what I learned in what I call the 10 Commandments of presidential leadership. Now, I believe these commandments are worthy of all leaders' attention, since they come from the people who faced their era's greatest challenges and made decisions in ways that have set the standard not just for presidential leadership, but for all who are in leadership positions. When I interviewed former White House Chief of Staff John Sununu for my book, he said something very important. He said, nothing happens in our federal government these days without presidential leadership. And he said the reason for that is because Congress is truly a herd of cats. He said the president and only the president has to manage the process, and if he doesn't, then the process does not get managed. That reminded me of something that Baseball Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson once said during his glory days with the New York Yankees, when he would always describe himself as the straw who stirred the drink. So if Reggie was going to try to make John Sununu's point using his own words, in our federal government, it's our president who's the straw that stirs the drink. So keeping that thought in mind on the importance of presidential leadership in our government and in American history, let's now turn to the 10 Commandments of presidential leadership and the presidents who epitomized each of them. And to help you remember the commandments and the presidents, at the end of each, I'm going to tie the president to his namesake landmark here in Washington, D.C. The first commandment, a great leader shall be conscience in chief. We always think of the president as commander-in-chief, and that, of course, is in the Constitution. But the great leaders are more than that. They're the conscience-in-chief, the highest level of integrity, a moral compass that's locked on true north, so we can count on the president to do the right thing when times get tough or when they think that no one is looking. And the president who set the standard as conscience-in-chief was our first president, George Washington. And to understand more and deeper about the life and times of George Washington for my book, I interviewed award-winning historians David and Jean Heidler. She is a professor of history at the Air Force Academy. I went to the Colorado Springs and interviewed them there at the Air Force Academy. And their book, Washington's Circle, came out in early 2015, got a huge review in the Wall Street Journal. And since Washington is such a standard of integrity, that was a big part of the interview. How did it manifest itself so that he would appear as conscience-in-chief? Where did this high level of integrity come from? Well, in terms of how he presented himself as conscience-in-chief and made people believe in it, they said a big part of it was physical. George Washington was a large man. He was 6'2", which would be like being 6'8" today, given the average height of people then and now. But beyond this size, he had these penetrating pale blue eyes and this broad lion-like nose. And whenever he would speak publicly, he always spoke very slowly. And he did that to make sure that he never misspoke, such that to hear George Washington speak was almost like listening to the voice of God. But beyond just the physical way he presented himself, where did this integrity come from? The Heidler said that a big part of it came early in his life when he was learning how to do cursive handwriting. That is George Washington's autograph. You can see he had a very strong hand, very flourishing hand. Of course, he learned to write in the mid-1700s. And in those days, the way people learned how to do cursive handwriting was working off of what were called copybooks. These were published books with beautiful handwriting, and you would attempt to copy the beautiful handwriting until your writing looked just like it. And George Washington's favorite copybook was one written by Jesuit priests, and it was entitled Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. And Washington seized on this book. There were 110 rules. He copied them over and over again until he knew them backwards and forwards. And the idea was that as you disciplined your hand, you also disciplined your mind to remember what you were writing. And that certainly was the case with George Washington. These rules became his code for living for the rest of his life. To give you an idea of what these rules were about, I'll give you my two favorite. The first one was every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to all who are present. The second one I particularly like, which is tied to this first commandment, is labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Now, after mastering these rules of civility and decent behavior and living them all his life, during his presidency, he maintained with daily vigilance this integrity by reading devotionals every day, going to church every Sunday, and making sure that every action he took as our first president was in complete compliance with our new Constitution as well as the Jesuit rules. Now, he left the presidency in 1797 and then died in 1799. Obviously, there was a national outpouring of grief over the loss of our beloved first president. And there was a historian in 1800 named Parson Weems who decided he wanted to do something special to preserve the legacy of George Washington. He decided he wanted to write a biography of him. And in those days, we didn't have great libraries, great research tools. And so, obviously, there was a lot in the public record about Washington's military career and, of course, his time in politics. But to understand his personality and how he operated, there wasn't a whole lot there. So Parson Weems did what historians of his era did. He made stuff up. And the most famous story that he made up was the story that at age 6, George Washington said, "I cannot tell a lie, Papa. I cut down the cherry tree with my hatchet." Well, now that was an early 19th century Aesop fable, but it absolutely told the truth about the lifelong integrity of George Washington. So, here in D.C., of course, we have the radiant Washington Monument. Whenever you see it, think of it as a capital I that stands for the integrity of George Washington, who set the standard for being conscience in chief. The second commandment, the great leader shall stay above the partisan fray and shall build consensus with those who are across the aisle. Now, building consensus is an essential part of the American success story. E pluribus unum has been on our money forever, out of many, one. And the president who set the standard in showing how to go about building consensus with those across the aisle was Thomas Jefferson. And for my book, to understand more and deeper about Thomas Jefferson, I interviewed Peter Onuf. Peter was the Thomas Jefferson Professor of History at the University of Virginia for over 20 years and has written 6 books on Thomas Jefferson. And obviously, I interviewed Peter in 2015. My book came out in 2016. In the world we're living in, we don't have many people who are able to cross the aisle and build consensus. So I spent a big chunk of the interview understanding how did Thomas Jefferson do it, particularly because I knew that in his era, the society was every bit as polarized, perhaps more so, than our society is now. to the extent that during John Adams' presidency, who was number 2, Jefferson was our 3rd president, during Adams' presidency, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1798, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize President Adams or any Federalist leader or policy. So it was into this fray that Thomas Jefferson became president, in which people were literally in jail because they had exercised their right of free speech and freedom of speech of the press and criticized John Adams and ended up in jail for it. And Thomas Jefferson, when he took office in March of 1801, in his first inaugural address, set the tone for his administration. And very close to the very beginning, he said, "We are all Federalists, and we're all Republicans." And he went from there over the next 8 years of his presidency. Now, Harold Saunders, an American diplomat, wrote a book called Politics is About Relationships. How do you build consensus with those across the aisle? You build good relationships with them. And Peter Onuf said, here's how Jefferson went about it during his 8-year presidency. He hosted a steady stream of dinner parties, month after month, year after year, where the only invited guests were the leaders of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party, of course, had been led by Adams and Alexander Hamilton. The Republican Party, led by Jefferson and Madison. Brand new country. We'd only been around a little over a decade, and Jefferson said, I'm going to bring this country back together. That's the only way that this is going to work. It's the only way this country's going to survive. So over these dinner parties, great food, great wine, great conversation. Thomas Jefferson was a very charming human being. He could talk about anything, art, architecture, music. He was an accomplished violinist. Politics, history, literature, you name it, and Thomas Jefferson could talk about it. And over the course, month after month, year after year, the walls started coming down and the polarization started to melt away. And that was his chief priority, to make sure that this country was going to survive. So here you've got the Jefferson Memorial. When you look at it, think of each of those columns as a faction. A separate faction, but then think of how these factions become unified under the perfect Jefferson dome. And remember Thomas Jefferson as a president who showed us how to build consensus with those across the aisle. The third commandment, a great leader shall know his limitations and shall know how to supplement his limitations. And the president who set the standard in this trait was James Madison. This is about self-awareness. This is about knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses. And in those areas where you're weak, being able to align and partner with those who are strong in the areas where you're weak. And the historian who I interviewed on Madison was award-winning historian David Stewart, lives in Maryland nearby. He had a great book that came out in early 2015, Madison's Gift, which was entirely about Madison's capacity to partner with those who were strong in the areas where he was weak, and that with these partnerships doing more than either could have done individually. Now, Madison knew his strengths. He knew he was brilliant. It was a level-headed sort of brilliance. It wasn't a creative brilliance. But he was in the center. He's the guy we call the father of the Constitution and inventing our new government. He also knew he was unbelievably hardworking. He had a work ethic second to none. Nobody could outwork James Madison. But he also knew his weaknesses. He was a shrimp. He was 5'4". He weighed less than 100 pounds. George Washington, when he entered a room, everybody took notice. When James Madison entered a room, nobody took notice. Madison also knew his weakness in public speaking. He had zero charisma. And as I've said, in terms of his brilliance, he knew he lacked creativity. And if you're going to form a brand new government, you want to think you're considering all the options, you got to have creativity. So what did Madison do to make up for the fact that he was a scrawny little guy that got lost in every crowd? He partnered with great big George Washington. They locked arms at the Constitutional Convention. and in the early days of Washington's presidency, and did more together than either could have done individually. And Washington was also self-aware. He knew he was not brilliant. He needed Madison's horsepower. And so that's why they proved to be such a great team. What did Madison do to make up for the fact that he had no charisma? He partnered up with the most dynamic of our founders, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was also self-aware. He knew that he needed somebody equally brilliant and equally hardworking if he was going to accomplish this goal of getting our new Constitution ratified by the states. So Hamilton came up with this brilliant idea, the Federalist Papers. But he knew he couldn't do it by himself. So he aligned with Madison, and together they wrote the Federalist Papers and led the charge to get the Constitution ratified. John Jay wrote one paper. Those two guys wrote the rest, and that's the only way the job got done. What did Madison do to compensate for the fact that he was level-headed smart but lacked creativity? He partnered with a creative genius, Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson was also self-aware. He knew that a lot of his creative ideas were off the wall. They didn't make sense. He needed somebody level-headed to bring him down to earth. And together they had this perfect balance, two brilliant men working side by side to help create our new government. So here in Washington, D.C., at the Library of Congress, we have the James Madison Memorial Building. And of course, in the Library of Congress, we have the original of the Constitution. Now recognize that the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, that the words in it only have strength in the way they are partnered together. The words standing alone have no import. So when you think of that cherished part of our history, think of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and his capacity with his self-awareness to partner with those who were strong in the areas where he was weak. Our fourth commandment, a great leader shall be able to persevere over setbacks. Think of boxing. The great leader, when he gets knocked flat on the mat, has the capacity to get back up and maintain that same pursuit of whatever his goal is. That's what great leaders do. And the president who set the standard in this trait was Franklin Roosevelt. Now, to go deeper on Franklin Roosevelt for my book, I interviewed Ken Burns. I'm sure many of you saw his documentary, The Roosevelts, in the fall of 2014. I also interviewed Jeffrey Ward, Ken's collaborator, but who's also written 3 biographies on FDR, one of which was a finalist for the Pulitzer. And James Tobin, the National Book Critics Award winner, who had a great book, The Man He Became, How Franklin Roosevelt Defied Polio on His Rise to the Presidency. And in all these interviews, obviously a big part of the focus was recognizing that until he was 39 years old, Franklin Roosevelt led a very active life. He loved golf. He loved outdoor recreational activities. He loved to dance. He loved to work the crowds hard as he pursued his high political ambitions. And then all of a sudden, 1921, he was hit with the polio virus and he lost the use of his legs for the rest of his life. It was a 7-year hiccup. It took 7 years for him to come up with a strategy for resuming his career and not losing his ultimate goal of following in the footsteps of his cousin Theodore. And all the biographers said it was all about steadfast resolve. It was all about maintaining a self-confidence that kept a smile on his face even after he had lost the bounce in his step. And by overcoming this major disability that no one had ever been able to overcome before, Roosevelt proved the wisdom of Joseph Campbell. Where you stumble, that's where your treasures lie. Yeah, when you lose the use of your legs, that's a stumble. That's a major setback. But all of his biographers said, you know what? It made him a better man. It made him a much more attractive candidate. For the first time in his life, he had empathy, he had humility, he had patience. He had never had any of those traits before, and that allowed him to connect with a much bigger part of the American populace. So there's the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial here in D.C. You look at that face, that is one strong face. That's a face that can see us through a depression and a world war. But you also see that he's seated and cloaked so as not to draw attention to his polio-ravaged legs. So when you see that image, think of the president who set the standard in this important trait of being able to persevere and overcome obstacles through steadfast resolve, like Franklin Roosevelt. The fifth commandment, the great leader shall know how to play hardball when necessary. And the president who set the standard in that trait was Dwight Eisenhower. And for my book, to go deeper on Eisenhower, I interviewed Gene Edward Smith, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And in my interview with him, he told this great story that epitomized Eisenhower's capacity to play hardball when necessary. It was the fall of 1956. It was 1 month before the November election. Eisenhower was finishing his first term, and a week later, we'd be elected for his second term. And all of a sudden, England, France, and Israel joined forces and invaded Egypt and seized the Suez Canal. And they knew that that was against Eisenhower's wishes, but they thought they could get away with it because it was 1 week before the election. They thought, well, Eisenhower doesn't want to lose the Jewish vote. He won't do anything since Israel's involved in this. And they were wrong. As soon as it happened, Eisenhower called his Secretary of the Treasury. He said, I want you to go out and make a run on the British pound. Buy up all the pounds you possibly can. And he did. And as soon as that had happened, Eisenhower called the British Prime Minister and said, if you don't get all those troops out of the Suez right now, I will drive your pound down to zero. What was he going to do? All the troops came out of the Suez, and that's how you play hardball when people get out of line and disrupt your potential for achieving your goals. Now, hopefully in the next couple of years here in Washington, D.C., we'll have a finished Eisenhower Memorial. It's been going on too long. They can't seem to agree on the design. But in the meantime here, to remember Eisenhower, think of the Arlington National Cemetery and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And remember that before he was president, Eisenhower was our supreme Allied commander during World War II. And he served with distinction in that role and as president for many reasons. But one of the main ones was because he knew how to play hardball when necessary in order to make sure he achieved his goals. The sixth commandment, a great leader shall know how to remain calm in a crisis. A great leader never wants to appear that he's panicked. He always wants to appear that he's in a mode of being able to make good decisions. And the president in the modern era who set the standard for that was John F. Kennedy. And to go deeper on President Kennedy, for my book, I interviewed Sheldon Stern, who for over 20 years was a historian in residence at the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, and who is the author of 3 books on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the most recent, the Cuban Missile Crisis in American memory. Now you'll remember, those people my age, that in October 1962, the Russians delivered nuclear missiles into Cuba, obviously just a few miles off the coast of Florida, and that sent President Kennedy and everybody into a mode of what for many people was panic. But when you're president, you can't panic. So Kennedy called all of his top advisors together, his cabinet, his other top insiders, and they had, over the course of 13 days, what were called the ExComm meetings, Executive Committee meetings. And over those 13 days, they negotiated with the Russians, they evaluated their options, and ultimately came up with a solution to end the crisis. And everybody who's in the meeting was unaware of one thing that only John and Bobby Kennedy knew, and that is those meetings were being taped. John and Bobby Kennedy had decided to secretly tape these meetings for purposes of preserving history, but they taped them on the same basis that Richard Nixon did, and that was they always thought they were going to be their personal property. They never imagined that it would go into the public domain. And we didn't get to hear the recordings of those 43 hours of tape-recorded conversation until the late 1990s, and Sheldon Stern was the first one to listen to all 43 hours. And he said in the interview that what stood out was, with each day that went by, all of Kennedy's advisors got more ramped up, voices louder, blood pressure up, demanded stronger and stronger retaliation. That's the only way we can ever get Russia to remove these missiles out of Cuba. And there was one calm voice in the room, and thank goodness it was the voice of the boss. President Kennedy, steady temperament, and over 13 days negotiated a resolution that caused the missiles to be withdrawn from Cuba, and we thereby avoided what surely would have been World War III. So when you go by the Kennedy Center, remember the calm leadership in a crisis of John F. Kennedy, and how because of that he helped us avoid World War III and allowed us to enjoy our American way of life, which among other things includes the ability to enjoy the arts at the Kennedy Center and other centers. The seventh commandment, the great leader shall be mindful of good timing when pursuing his initiatives. A great leader knows when to be patient and wait, and he also knows when to move. The philosopher Carlos Castaneda said, warriors/great leaders recognize the cubic centimeter of chance that can make or break them. And when it pops up, they move on it with the necessary speed and prowess to capitalize on the opportunity. And the president who set the standard in this trait in the modern era was Lyndon Johnson, in the way he went about pursuing our most important civil rights legislation. And to understand more about President Johnson and his civil rights leadership, I interviewed Taylor Branch, Pulitzer Prize-winning civil rights historian, Mark Updegrove, the head of the LBJ Library and an LBJ biographer, Linda Johnson Robb, LBJ's daughter, and Larry Temple, LBJ's White House counsel. And from them I learned the answer to the question that many of you probably wonder about, and that is, why did it take Lyndon Johnson so long to decide to become a leader in pushing civil rights legislation? He got to Congress in 1937, and between 37 and up until 57, he voted against every civil rights bill. And then in 57, as Senate Majority Leader, he took all the teeth out of the bill before it was passed, and it had no impact to speak of. But then all of a sudden, becoming president, he's the grand champion. Why did it take so long? And Lyndon Johnson was asked that question often, and he always had the same response. Folksy Texas metaphor that he was famous for. He said, you don't try to kill the snake until you got the hoe in your hand. Okay? As president, he finally had the hoe in his hand, and the snake were the Jim Crow segregation laws. Now, you'll recall that President Kennedy had served in Congress before he became president, and even his greatest fans and admirers acknowledged that he was pretty much a playboy during his years in Congress. He had no idea how to get legislation passed. And after he'd been president for a little over 2 years, he finally gave a strong civil rights speech and submitted a strong civil rights bill to Congress, but it was absolutely stuck in committee. He had no idea how to get it out at the time of his assassination. President Johnson seized on the opportunity, the hoe in his hand as new president. He looked at the country and he knew we had a national state of deep grieving. And he made the pitch to Republicans in Congress and to some of the Southern Democrats. He said, look, folks, we must make a major remembrance for the legacy of John F. Kennedy. The nation is grieving. Let's do something important as a way of showing our appreciation for the job he did. Let's make him the martyr for the cause of civil rights. And he used that argument to get the bill unstuck from the committee onto the floor. A few people tried to filibuster. He busted through the filibuster, and the Civil Rights Act was signed into law on July 2, 1964. Now, Mark Updegrove and Larry Temple in their interviews said the conventional wisdom was that it would have made more sense, you would think, for LBJ to have waited until after the November 1964 election to pursue such important legislation, but LBJ knew the cubic centimeter of chance would last only as long as the country was in a state of deep grief. He had to move quicker, and he couldn't wait on the election. This same capacity to pursue perfect timing came the next year in 1965 on the subject of voting rights. Nothing was happening. Nobody knew how to make it happen to get a strong voting rights bill. And then all of a sudden we had Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, March 7, 1965, when armed police troops started beating up unarmed African Americans who were trying to march from Selma to Montgomery as a protest against the lack of voting rights in Alabama at the time. LBJ said, "There's my cubic centimeter of chance." ABC television was there. They televised it, and to most of America, it looked like Nazis beating up Jews in World War II. There was a national sense of moral outrage. We cannot allow this to happen in our country. And LBJ, within a few days, gave his great "We Shall Overcome" speech to Congress. National television audience the next day submitted a strong voting rights bill to Congress, and shortly it became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He did the same thing with fair housing. Martin Luther King, April 4, 1968, at a time when the fair housing bill was stuck, the House refused to agree to the Senate version of the bill. He did with MLK what he'd done with JFK, a national state of deep grief. Let's find a way to honor the legacy of this important leader. Let's make him a martyr for the cause of fair housing. And he did, and within a week, the House had agreed to the Senate version of the bill, and we had the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So here in Washington, we have the Lyndon B. Johnson Department of Education building, and when you go by it, remember that it was only because Johnson knew how to move with perfect timing in pursuing his civil rights initiatives that we got civil rights legislation passed sooner rather than later. The eighth commandment, a great leader shall be a great communicator and shall follow through and do what he says. It's not just about making a great speech. You got to follow through. And the president in the modern era who was best at this was Ronald Reagan, the person we call the great communicator. And to go deep on Reagan, for my book, I interviewed his first-term White House Chief of Staff and second-term Secretary of the Treasury, James Baker, and his biographer, Pulitzer finalist H.W. Brands. And since Reagan, of course, had been known as the great communicator, I spent a fair chunk of the interview. How did he do it? Well, the conventional wisdom was, well, of course he was a great communicator. He'd been an actor. He knew how to look the camera in the eye and deliver his lines with full dramatic force. But H.W. Brands said, people forget he wasn't a very good actor. What separated Reagan as a great communicator was this positive outlook, this cheerful countenance, this spirit of optimism that gave Americans hope and allowed him to channel the voice, the inner voice of the American people. That's what made Ronald Reagan the great communicator. And James Baker said it was his consistent, confident, steadfast message over time against Soviet communism that was the key to getting the momentum going toward bringing an end to the Cold War. Now, as you know, in the modern era, president's speeches are written by speechwriters, although the boss has the final say in the final draft. And the most important speech of Reagan's presidency was when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, that speech containing those lines went through many drafts, and every time his speechwriters took those words out. They thought they were too inflammatory and would alienate the Soviets, and Reagan kept putting them back in because he knew that the time, June 12, 1987, was right. The place, West Berlin's Brandenburg Gate, was right, and his entire foreign policy message that he had been saying since his first political speech in 1964 had finally arrived, and to heck with the speechwriters, he delivered the line that will forever give him a special place in our history. Tear down this wall. 4 words each one syllable, simple and clear and passionate and right on the mark. And then he followed through and kept that momentum going to bring an end to the Cold War that, of course, ended with his successor, George H.W. Bush. But everyone remembers who got the momentum going to bring it to the successful conclusion. So here in D.C., of course, you fly in and out of Reagan Airport, and you think about airports and aviation and pilots. Things have got to be clear. Things have got to be consistent. You've got to be optimistic, and you've got to have follow-through if you're going to be a great pilot. And those were the traits that made Ronald Reagan the great communicator. The 10th commandment, the great leader shall put the nation's welfare above his own personal political interest. And the president who set the standard in this trait was George H.W. Bush in the modern era. And to go deeper on President Bush, I interviewed his biographer, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham, his Secretary of State James Baker, his White House Chief of Staff John Sununu. And we all, people my age, remember the 1988 Republican Convention when he told the convention, the national TV audience, "Read my lips, no new taxes." 6 words that he came to regret. Now, the tax issue was huge, but they were a two-edged sword. The Reagan tax cuts for 8 years had been very popular. They had grown the economy, but they had also taken our national debt to record highs. And then when Bush became president, it got so bad that the rest of the world started reducing the amount of T-bills they were buying over fear about America losing strength because it had this record level of debt. And it came to a head in 1990 with the budget negotiations, and both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democratic Party at the time, and they refused to cut spending. So if we were going to have any money available to try to bring down the debt, there was only one source, and that would be with new taxes. And so President Bush went back on his convention pledge, and it immediately caused a Newt Gingrich-led revolt in the Republican Party and was certainly a factor in his losing the 1992 election. Now, could he have kept that pledge? Of course he could have, but it would have meant a stalemate in the budget talks, which would have shut down the government with no money available to bring the deficit down necessary to let the world know that, in fact, we could take care of our business and bring down this debt. So here in D.C., you have the George Bush Center for the Intelligence. That's the headquarters for the CIA. And when you think of George Bush, remember him not only as an intelligent, but also a courageous president. He knew the political consequences of breaking his convention pledge, but he did what was right for the country to start dealing with the deficit. The 10th and final commandment, the great leader shall stay abreast of public sentiment and find ways to shape it. And the president who set the standard with this commandment was Abraham Lincoln. I saved the best for last, our greatest president. Lincoln had once said, "Public sentiment is everything. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or he who pronounces judicial decisions." And the 2 historians I interviewed on Lincoln were Harold Holzer, winner of the Lincoln Prize, and Ron White, New York Times best-selling Lincoln biographer. And they talked about how in the very controversial issue of slavery during the Civil War, Lincoln knew the public sentiment and knew how to shape it to align with his vision when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln didn't want slavery anymore, but in that proclamation, he didn't say, "I'm emancipating these slaves on moral grounds. I'm emancipating them as a matter of military necessity." And he did that because he knew that many in the country in the North and the border states didn't know exactly what they thought about when to end slavery, how to end slavery. But everybody in the country knew we need this Civil War to end ASAP. And if you think as a matter of national security that we need to emancipate these slaves so that they can join the Northern war effort, then for heaven's sakes do it. And there was very little pushback on the Emancipation Proclamation. So when you see the Lincoln Memorial and you look at the statue of the great emancipator, remember, look in his eyes, he's looking at you, but he's looking beyond you because he had this big vision and he knew how to bring the public to understand and appreciate and buy into it. Now I'm going to close talking about where we are now. We certainly hope that President-elect Trump, is going to be able to embrace these 10 commandments of presidential leadership. Many of you are worried that perhaps he won't, and I'm going to close by trying to give you a little piece of recognizing that many of our greatest presidents entered the office with people very fearful about whether or not they would be able to do the job. H.W. Brands had a column in the Wall Street Journal in early October identifying Jefferson, Jackson, Roosevelt, and Reagan, who came in and people were scared to death of what they'd be like. And then I did one in the Dallas Morning News that ran the Sunday before the election day. When Thomas Jefferson came in, people thought he was going to be a mad Jacobin because he had supported the French Revolution. They thought his election would place the country in grave peril. When Andrew Jackson came in, people of the stature of Thomas Jefferson said he was unfit for the presidency, with very little respect for the laws of the Constitution, a dangerous man. When Theodore Roosevelt came in, Mark Hanna, the senator from Ohio, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, said, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between that madman and the presidency?" When Woodrow Wilson came in, there were big reservations. He'd been governor of New Jersey for a little over a year when he was elected president. All he'd been was a president of Princeton. How could he possibly know how to do the job? Dwight Eisenhower, people weren't convinced that he was really smart enough to do the job, and because he'd spent his whole career in the military, they thought he was going to be much too focused on the military. Instead, he's the one who brought the military down and warned us of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. When Ronald Reagan came in, he was viewed by many as a dangerous extremist and mocked as a lightweight actor. And when George H.W. Bush, you remember the cover of Newsweek, the wimp factor. People thought he was a wimp. There was also the vision thing. People thought he didn't have any vision. If he's such a wimp, look at the results of the Gulf War. Talk about vision, talk about bringing the world together after the end of the Cold War. So I hope that gives you something new and different to think about as we look to the future with the new regime. Many are fearful, many are angry, and just remember that we're not always right, and don't we all think we should give the president-elect a chance? Maybe he'll surprise us. It's certainly in the country's best interest if he does. Thank you very much. Questions? We have, this is a national live stream on the National Archives, so if you have a question, please go to a microphone so that we can, everybody can hear it. Yes, sir.
First of all, just a correction. You mentioned the constitutions at the Library of Congress. I'm sure the chief archivist had a heart attack at that point.
Oh, sorry.
It is upstairs.
Okay, thank you for correcting me.
All of the people, all of the 10 that you mentioned, 9 of them had some form of military experience. I'm counting FDR as Secretary of Navy. And all of them had legislative experience. How vital is that to them being truly important as presidents, military as well as legislative?
Well, obviously, it is important. I don't know that it's necessarily essential. And when we think of our greatest president, I think the contrast between James Buchanan, our 15th president, and Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, is best helps to answer your question. Nobody had a better resume of political experience than James Buchanan before he became president. He'd been in Congress, he'd been in the cabinet, he was eminently qualified, and he is always on the list of among our 5 worst presidents. Lincoln had legislative experience in Illinois, but he had only had a single 2-year term in Congress before he became president. And in terms of his military experience, he had volunteered during the Black Hawk War, but had never seen actual combat. And of course, it didn't last very long. So what we learn from studying presidential history is the people who emerge as the great ones are the self-taught, the people who may not have had the full experience to enter into their minds, but because of their being leaders and students of history on the order of Harry Truman, on the order of Abe Lincoln, that's what can sometimes more than compensate for a shortage of experience. So do I think that because President-elect Trump has never served in the military and never served in politics. There's no way in the world he can possibly handle the job? No. Woodrow Wilson had almost no political experience whatsoever. And in many ways, he's always rated as a top 20 president. He did a great job in getting the country, knowing exactly when to enter World War I and minimizing American involvement. And despite never having served in Congress, getting much important progressive legislation passed as president. So of course, it's concerning when somebody really doesn't have the kind of experience that we're accustomed to with our previous presidents. But there are examples in history of people who were able to overcome that lack of experience through hard work, through hard study, and through having emotional intelligence. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. The Second
Just
Amendment.
ask them one at a time. I'm not very good on two-part questions.
The Second Amendment. the second tenet there that you
Rising
identified.
above the partisan fray.
Yes.
Building consensus with those across the aisle.
Yeah, I'm just curious why you didn't put Lyndon Johnson in that category, because to pass the legislation that he passed, the civil rights, much of the social legislation, and to some extent the intervention in
I easily
Vietnam.
could have. I mean, and for those of you who hopefully are smart enough to buy my book after this program, you'll see at the end of it where I have my closing thoughts. That's where I have these 10 commandments. And for each of them, I mentioned 2, 3, 4, 5 different presidents who epitomize them. But as you've noticed, I wanted a different president for each of the 10. And since I had committed the commandment on perfect timing and the cubic centimeter of chance to Lyndon Johnson, that's why he's that. And of course, although Johnson obviously was president at a very challenging time in our history, for purposes of building consensus at a time of the highest polarization, when people being thrown in jail for criticizing those on the other side, I thought the Jefferson example. So in putting this speech together, I knew I had limited time, and I wanted to devote one president to each trait, and so that's why I made that decision.
Okay. My second question, with the emergence of the press, basically influencing the presidency, your 10th tenet, would you, at some point, is it possible that could be expanded to address the growing role of the press in basically framing the role of the presidency as well as the individual who occupy
That's a
that
great point, and because I was running short on time, I actually cut a few sentences. But one of the things was Lincoln was key as president, as all successful communication presidents are, at knowing how to work within the confines of the media to get his message across. And Lincoln would write editorials that were carried nationwide. He would, on occasion, strategically leak information to the press. He would also write a letter to the editor of one paper that he would circulate nationwide. It would go viral. These were the ways Lincoln used the media of his day to get his points across, knowing where the public sentiment was, and trying to persuade the public sentiment to understand his point of view and why they might and should move their thinking to align with his vision. So it was absolutely in the context of, obviously in those days there wasn't television, there wasn't radio, it was all about the newspapers, and Lincoln was the master of the media of his era in getting his views spread throughout the country, because the newspapers were the only way you could do that at that time. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, I would love to meet all of you upstairs outside of the gift shop where the Library of Congress the National Archives has been nice enough to have copies of my books available for sale. And what a great opportunity it's been to be with you this afternoon.